Hi, everybody. Charlie and Linda are back with you. We've been gone for almost a month. We were in Asia. We took a group to Vietnam. We had a fabulous time. And it's very wonderful to be back with you today. We're going to be inquiring into the issue of the things that it's important to know about your partner before you tie the knot. So there's a number of things that are really important to discover about each other, and often people move in together, even get married, without having some crucial conversations. And if you believe that planning and preparation prevent problems, which we certainly do, you can't head off all the difficulties at the past, because of course life is going to give us some surprises. But to the degree that we can anticipate some of the things that come up for all couples when they make a commitment to each other, and we discuss those openly in a spirit of goodwill and with full disclosure, we are going to get off at the best possible start. And there's some important reasons why people don't bring up the tough subjects. They think that it's intrusive or it's pushy, or that if they start asking a lot of these penetrating questions, that their partner is going to ask some penetrating questions of them, and it may be a little close to the bone. But we think it's one of those situations where it's either pay now or pay later. Either you have the difficult, uncomfortable, and enlightening conversations up front, or else maybe you're going to be blindsided by some of these issues later. So we say get it handled in the beginning, and that will give you the edge to have success sooner rather than later.
Well, sometimes I can be a man of few words, and sometimes I can't. But today, I have just one word for you, and that is Sing Chao, which is the Vietnamese word for hello, which is the entire length of my Vietnamese vocabulary.
But you say it very well.
So now you know every word in Vietnamese that I know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we're going to do this talk in English because it would be very repetitive. I only used the one word that I know in Vietnamese. So yeah, we're going to talk about some of the things that it might be a good idea to talk about before you, as Linda says, tie the knot, which when you think about it is not a particularly pleasant metaphor, particularly if the knot is kind of around your neck. But sometimes that's what it can feel like. And sometimes that's an association that people have with getting into a committed partnership, that they are getting locked in or tied into something that might be limiting their freedom. So there's a lot of different competing concerns that we have when it comes to getting clear about whether or not we really want to and feel trusting that this person can make a great partner for us on the long term. We don't always take the time that we need in order to find out as much as we can about whether or not we're a good fit, because sometimes there are other factors that are impinging on our good judgment that might make it difficult for us to do the investigation and the exploration and uncover some answers to some of the very important questions that need to be addressed and acknowledged and answered in the process of finding out whether we are a good fit. So today we're going to look at what some of those questions might be and how we can deal with what might be some of our reticence or reluctance to engage in that process.
Mhm. It's scary sometimes to hear the other person's truth because it might not jibe with our truth. And it's scary to find out that it may be in the deal breaker category. For instance, if you're deeply involved with somebody, maybe you allowed yourself to fall in love with somebody and you want to have children, but perhaps they don't, that's a conversation waiting to be had. Some years ago, I worked with somebody who was madly in love with a man and they were compatible in every kind of way. And she just assumed that, of course, they were going to have kids together. And when the subject finally was broached, which was several months, even a year into the relationship, she found out that he didn't want to have any children. And they had to separate because there's no way to compromise because you can't have half of a kid. And so to have the conversation about children, about whether that's on the agenda for you, and not to assume that you're going to be able to have as many children as you want. Maybe they're willing to have children, but they only want to have one. And so not to assume that, that you could have two or more. Really incredible, important baseline conversation to have. Another one is about money. Usually, because the opposites attract, there's one in the pair that's free with spending and the other person that's more conservative with spending. In the field, they call that the spender and the saver. And to talk about your attitudes about money, how you manage money, how much money you feel you need to be saving each month, each year, towards your retirement fund. And to have those conversations can often save you a lot of trouble down the line, that you don't argue about money, that you put some kind of guidelines in place in the beginning about paying attention to money. And one other thing that comes up a lot with couples as they age, their parents are aging, and to see where you stand about the aging parent who may be ill, maybe can't live independently anymore. One of the pair may say, well, that's how we do it in our family. Of course, we would never put them into an old age home. Of course, they would come to live with us. And the other person's more private and would say, I'm not having my privacy interrupted by having anybody else live in the house with us. Our kids is one thing, but your parents or my parents are another thing altogether. And so to have a respectful communication about the kids, about the aging parents, and about money. Those are really important top of the list issues.
Yeah. I want to say something. I want to go back to something that Linda alluded to a little earlier about the things that can sometimes get in the way of engaging in the kinds of conversations that we're talking about here, which are very personal, very revealing. Sometimes we can even reveal things to ourselves that we're not aware of when we start asking some of these very important questions that we may have not really given all that much thought to ourselves. But when we're invited to look at things like, well, how do you believe money should be handled, or what's your take on how we're going to raise the kids, or some of these questions that many people don't really look at until the time comes, and then there can be some surprises if they have made assumptions that aren't necessarily correct. So one of the things that we found that people hit, one of the obstacles has to do with what the feeling is like of infatuation when we begin to fall in love with somebody, and how at some point, and it can be very early on, we make a conscious or even an unconscious decision that this is the one. And a lot of you have heard that term, or used the term, the one, as though, out of the 7.5 billion people on the planet, there's only one, and you happen to be fortunate enough to have found that one man or woman or whoever. And once we kind of lock into that feeling like, this is the one, I've got to have her, I've got to have him, then we're not particularly interested in examining anything that could persuade us to reconsider our decision or could potentially do that. You know, it's like, I know this is the person, and I don't want to, mess with it. I don't want to question things. I just want to go ahead and lock this in, firm this up. As most of us have learned the hard way, that you can be absolutely madly, completely in love with somebody, head over heels, and think that there's no way you could ever feel any different about such a wonderful person. And then at some point in the future, could be 3 years, could be 6 months, could be 20 minutes later, you realize, oh, this is not the person I thought. I didn't think that they had this quality, or I thought that, So we've got to be willing to be courageous. We've got to be willing to have the courage to take the risk of opening up a potential can of worms, because the consequence, the alternative to finding out later rather than sooner, that is, after the commitment's been made, after you've tied the knot, so to speak, after the first child is born, the consequences to finding out that this does not look like we're an adequate match, that's pretty tough. Better to find out sooner than later.
Mm-hmm. So I'm glad you brought that point up. This is a more conservative approach. And what we recommend to the young couples who are still in infatuation stage, or maybe it's not young couples, midlife couples.
Well, you can be infatuated at any age. Any age.
But wait until the infatuation wears off, because there's a chemical process going on in our body when we're falling in love, and we're really kind of drugged, so we're not exactly in our right mind. So if you can wait until the infatuation settles down, the chances of seeing each other clearly, this is a more conservative approach. In some ways we're risky, but on making a choice of a life partner, we're more on the conservative end about that. And we want you to know well yourself and your partner to see if you're a good match. If you discover that there are irreconcilable differences that can't be overcome, and every couple has some irreconcilable differences, but if there's some in the deal breaker category, you want to know that sooner rather than later. Hopefully before you have children together, because it's harder to extricate yourself from a difficult relationship once you have that kind of a commitment to your children as well. So other issues that come up that are really essential to discuss before you tie the knot is how you're going to handle differences, and how you handle differences already, because they're for sure going to come up. You're going to have differences about sexuality. You're going to have differences about money. You're going to have differences about the in-laws. You're going to have differences about personal freedom and togetherness and how you spend your leisure time and vacations. And the differences are going to show themselves. So you want to have some conversations about how do you handle differences? Are you adept at handling differences? Do you have a spirit of goodwill? Are you flexible? Or are you more on the dominating or submissive end of the spectrum, which will end up getting you in trouble? And this is very important. If you hit the wall and you do everything you can, and a difference keeps showing itself, and it's aggravating you, do you have an agreement in place to find someone, a third party, maybe a professional, maybe a clergy, maybe you have a wise relative in your family, but that you won't be closeted about the trouble that you're in, the confusion that you're in, the impasse that you have, and that you will seek help and not just stand it and live with it, because it can diminish the well-being of your life and your relationship. Important. How well do you handle your differences?
And the reason that we can guarantee you that you're going to have differences, and no matter how much you talk about it in advance, you're still going to be faced with the ongoing challenges that come up when those differences appear, differences in your perspective. And we're not saying that if you've got differences, then, you know, you got to call it off. What we're saying is that we need to make the distinction. We need to distinguish the differences that can be accommodated and held in the relationship, and the ones that for one or both of us are deal breakers. You know, for example, a difference about whether or not we want to be parents, that's a pretty significant one. That's not necessarily one that a person can say, well, you know, we can, like Linda said, of course, we can't compromise on it. You can't, well, unless you're Solomon, you can't split a child, and you don't want to do that. But we have to look at, well, what are the things that we can live with, and what are the conditions that absolutely are deal breakers? You know, I cannot tolerate something like this. You know, for example, some people want to have an open marriage. Some people want to be monogamous. Some people can be flexible about that. Some people, no way. It's all or nothing here. You know, we're either totally in here with both feet committed to each other, no exceptions, no sexual contact with anyone outside the relationship. And, you know, some people, you know, may be more flexible about that. We don't take a position on that in terms of how you should or shouldn't be, except that you really want to know prior to making that commitment where you both are about issues that are potentially problematic or even explosive sometimes. So, you know, there's good reason why we can be reluctant to bring up some of these things, because it's not comfortable to talk about, and it is a risk. And there's also another factor, and that's that there can be a hope that even if we have some of these major differences, that I know that my love will eventually bring her around, and she will see the truth to my position, to my perspective, which she's not able to see right now, but she'll appreciate it, you know, in time. She'll change, or he'll change. Not a good idea to go into a committed partnership with the expectation or the hope or the condition that they will change and then everything's going to be fine. They may. However, what we found is that it's likely that if you go in with that expectation, you're going to be very disappointed. And there's a saying that I think has a lot of validity to it, which is that expectations are premeditated resentments. So be careful if you're going into a relationship or considering a commitment on the basis of the hope or the expectation that that person will change or can be changed.
So the issue of sexuality is an important one to have full discussion about beforehand, because sometimes people are on different pages about it. Charlie brought up one issue, that one person, monogamy is absolutely necessary for them, and the other person, polyamorous relationship would be acceptable. You need to find some common ground, because that can be a deal breaker in the relationship. Even if you're on the same page about monogamy, usually there's one in the pair who has a desire for more sexual contact than the other. Doesn't necessarily have to be a problem, but there need to be some guidelines in place about it. particularly as your relationship evolves, children come, the new baby, there's fatigue, sometimes a lot of energy is going to the new baby, and the romantic partnership can be neglected, particularly the sexual part of the relationship. And to have some general guidelines about the changing life stages, the aging life stage. And if the sexual part of the relationship is really important to one in the pair, it's important to both in the pair. And to have some agreements in place that if one person is still very interested in sexuality, that it's off the table to have a sexless marriage. And that's lessons in patience for the person with high desire, and it's lessons in just generosity for the person with lower desire, but that you have some guideline in place that you won't ever be in the position where you feel sex starved, because it can impact heavily the well-being and the happiness in the partnership.
There's another area that is often neglected in terms of what we consider to be essential conversations to have before making a commitment. And that has to do with the whole notion of how do we know when it's time to get help? And what do we do if one of us feels like we need help and the other one doesn't? Or let's say one person just doesn't believe in counseling or getting any kind of guidance from professionals or anybody, and they want to keep it very private and they don't want to, disclose that's, what's going on. That's something that it's really very important to know about prior to making that commitment, because some people can get very positioned on that and say, absolutely, I come from a family, or I come from a culture in which we don't discuss these things. We don't bring people in. This is our problem. We need to deal with this ourselves. I don't want to bring somebody else in, or I don't know about, how to know who to trust. And it's really, my parents, handled it this way, and that's the way I want to handle it. So somehow it's really important to find out where do we each stand on this. We often encourage people who have problems around this, where they've got conflict around whether or not and under what conditions and at what point do you invite somebody else in or request professional help. And one of the things we encourage people to do is to create an agreement that if one person feels that that they've done all that they can do, and that we've both done our best, and we're at that point now where our efforts are not making things better. In fact, they're making things worse, because we keep getting into these cycles that we can't break out of. That if one or both people begin to feel that way, then that's what you do. You do reach out and bring somebody in. That if one person feels that we have to get some help here, then that person's preference will prevail.
Right.
If it doesn't, then the problems that you have are very likely to deteriorate.
Mm-hmm. Here's another thing. In our many years of doing couples counseling, we find people who've been together for years and they've never had the conversation about priorities, about what's number one in heart and meaning in their life. And to have those discussions earlier rather than later, I believe is essential and important. Not everybody feels that the romantic partnership should be number one. Some people believe that career should be number one, and that the romantic partnership should support the development of one person's careers or both.
Or the kids should be
number one.
Yeah.
And that the romantic partnership should be lesser than that.
Or that their religious beliefs should be number
their
one.
Religious beliefs and their spiritual practice should be number one.
Yeah.
And their relationship with God is number one. Some people even believe that my relationship to my family of origin is primary, and my romantic partnership and the kids and career are all, and they're on different pages. Now, you don't have to be on the same page and identical in your beliefs and attitudes about all of these issues, but at least discuss them and understand. So I feel very strongly that I want my romantic partnership to be number one, not to neglect my children, not to neglect my children or my career, not to neglect my spiritual practice, but romantic partnership is number one. We haven't always been on the same page about it, but thank goodness we are now, and it really enlivens our relationship. And when you put your romantic partnership, whether committed partnership, marriage or not married, in the high priority position, naturally following that as a consequently, therefore, you will be tuned into your partner in a meaningful way. The nuances about how they want to be loved, whether it's touch or words of affirmation or how you spend your leisure time or gifts, these will all be prominent and high in your consciousness. So the love is flowing. And this is an important conversation to have at the beginning, in the middle, at any stage of relationship, to make sure that your partner's needs are being met and making sure your needs are being met. And if you can find out these important, essential components of what makes a relationship thrive early on, rather than later on, you're going to save yourself a whole lot of trouble.
So that's really what we're trying to do here today, is save you some trouble, and sometimes by avoiding some of the more uncomfortable topics and including them in the conversation, and being more willing to risk feeling a little discomfort, or sometimes even a lot, in the process of getting really clear about what matters to you as an individual, what matters to your partner, and what matters to the two of you as a couple. You can really spare yourself a lot of anguish later on. Mm-hmm. Like Linda said, pay now or you pay later. Uh-huh. And sometimes when you pay later, there's a lot of interest. Penalties that end up having to be paid too. Uh-huh. So I hope you've found this useful. If you have thoughts or questions about it that we haven't addressed, feel free to contact us. You can get all of the contact information that you need on our website, bloomwork.com. Uh-huh. And we will be back again next week. Do we know what we're going to talk about?
Yes, I just want to make a closing remark before I announce next week's topic.
Okay.
My closing remark is that it's a great act of service to your partner at the beginning, middle, and every stage of a relationship to bring up the tough subjects, to not be avoidant. There shouldn't be any no-fly zones. There shouldn't be any taboo subjects. And the ones that are gnarly and difficult to talk about, those are the most important ones to bring up. So this is an act of service at the highest level, to show your partner that they mean so much to you and the relationship means so much to you that you want to be open and honest and courageous about dealing with all of the issues. So next week's topic is the best preparation for marriage. And having these conversations is one of the best preparations for marriage. And we're going to explore some others. And it's never too late. If you didn't have some of these things in place before the marriage, you put them together now, and you can up-level the relationship that you have. So we're looking forward to seeing you next Thursday afternoon, and all the best.
Bye.